Welcome back to the Deep Dive. I'll be your host today, and I'm here with our resident expert to unpack something really special for you, the learner.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, I'm really thrilled to jump into this one. It's a fascinating topic.
It really is. Today, we're pulling from a great video summary of Morgan Housel's book, The Psychology of Money, along with our own research notes. And, our mission today is to answer a question that, frankly, bends the mind a little bit.
Hmm.
Why is financial success overwhelmingly dictated by human behavior rather than just, raw intelligence?
Yeah, that is the ultimate blind spot, right? Society just assumes the people at the top of the financial pyramid are, well, that they have some inherent genius.
Right.
Because traditional schools,
Mhm.
they teach money like it's a hard science.
Yeah.
Like math. They give you these rules and formulas and spreadsheets.
Like 2 plus 2 is always 4.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But then you step into the real world, and that logic just completely falls apart.
It totally does.
Yeah.
Because we have this real world contrast that isn't just hypothetical, like it actually happened.
Mhm.
On one hand, you have Ronald Reed, right? A humble janitor, spent his life sweeping floors, fixing cars, and he dies with an $8 million fortune.
Which is wild.
Yeah. And on the other hand, you have Richard Fuscone, this highly educated, top-tier Merrill Lynch executive who ends up filing for bankruptcy.
And that contrast perfectly illustrates the core thesis here. Money doesn't operate like a spreadsheet because, the people managing the money are not spreadsheets.
Right, we're human.
Exactly. Financial outcomes are deeply emotional. They're driven by our individual histories, our egos, our blind spots.
So if money isn't just math, then I guess judging other people's financial decisions is kind of a fool's errand.
Oh, absolutely. Before we can even talk about building wealth, we have to look at the different lenses we wear when we look at a dollar bill.
Okay, so let's unpack that.
Well, the source material starts with this really bold premise.
Okay.
No one is crazy.
No one.
No one. I mean, when you see someone do something with their money that makes absolutely zero sense to you.
Like cashing out a stable retirement fund to buy a boat.
Yeah, or throwing a massive loan into some highly volatile cryptocurrency. Your first instinct is to judge them, to call them reckless.
Because to me, that is reckless.
Right, but our financial worldview is shaped by a tiny, almost microscopic slice of personal experience.
Oh, I see, like the generational divide, right? Like if you were born in 1950, growing up in the shadow of the Great Depression, your parents probably had literal trauma around bank runs.
Exactly. So your view of risk is super cautious because caution kept your family alive.
But then contrast that with a millennial who came of age during the late 90s tech boom.
Right. Their foundational reality is entirely different. They watched internet companies just double in value overnight.
So what looks crazy to one generation is just normal to another.
And it means people are fundamentally playing entirely different games in the exact same market. You can't compare a 25-year-old day trader chasing hourly momentum to, say, a 65-year-old retiree whose only goal is just preserving capital.
Yeah, because their strategies look absurd to each other. The day trader thinks the retiree is sluggish.
And the retiree thinks the day trader is playing Russian roulette.
Right. Neither is objectively crazy. They just have different finish lines.
Exactly. Even something as catastrophic as the 2008 housing crash makes a dark kind of psychological sense here. Millions of people weren't acting irrationally in a vacuum. They were operating on a deeply held cultural belief that housing prices only go up.
Wow. It's almost like a religion. Like we inherit a financial faith from our parents, the economy of our first paychecks, our early mistakes. You either stick with it or rebel against it, but none of us are objective.
We're all wearing tinted glasses, which recontextualizes that Merrill Lynch executive, Richard Fuscone.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't lack intelligence. He operated in a hyper-competitive bubble that rewarded massive leverage.
So his decisions were rational for his bubble right up until the bubble popped. Okay, but wait, let me push back on this a bit. If we're all just playing our own games based on our past, how much of success is actually our brilliant strategy versus just, pure dumb luck?
Well, that is the really uncomfortable truth here. Society loves the self-made narrative. We want to believe success is just a linear result of hard work.
Sure, we all want to believe that.
But the reality involves these unseen hands, luck and risk. And they're just two sides of the exact same coin.
Unpredictable forces.
Right. The story of Bill Gates and Kent Evans really drives this home. We all know Bill Gates, brilliant guy, built Microsoft. But the text points out this crucial detail about the year 1968.
What happened in '68?
Gates happened to attend Lakeside School in Seattle, which happened to have a mother's club that bought a computer terminal from a rummage sale.
Oh, wow. A computer in a high school in 1968.
The odds were roughly 1 in a million. Gates even admitted that without Lakeside, there'd be no Microsoft. That's the unseen hand of luck.
But you mentioned Ken Evans. Who is that?
Kent was Gates' best friend at Lakeside. Equally brilliant, equally passionate about coding. They were scheming to build the future together.
Okay, so what happened to him?
He experienced the dark side of that coin. He died in a mountaineering accident before he even graduated high school.
Oh, man. That's awful.
It is. It's a tragic tail risk, an incredibly rare, unpredictable event that completely erased his trajectory. One teenager got a 1 in a million lucky break. The other faced a 1 in a million tragic risk.
Wow. That really changes how you look at magazine covers celebrating billionaires, you know? Like, mathematically, we shouldn't just ask what they did right. We should ask what lucky tailwinds they caught.
And what catastrophic risks they narrowly avoided.
Yes. And this brings us to tail events. In statistics, the tails are the extreme ends of a bell curve.
The highly improbable stuff.
Exactly. The financial world doesn't follow a normal distribution. It follows a power law. The vast majority of long-term outcomes are driven by a tiny, tiny fraction of these extreme tail events. Right, the notes used a baseball analogy for this, which really clicked for me. Like, if you fail to get a hit 70% of the time but succeed 30% of the time, you aren't just good. You're a Hall of Fame legend.
Because your few massive successes completely overshadow your failures. The stock market is the exact same. Just 4% of publicly traded stocks account for almost all long-term returns.
Wait, really? Just 4%?
Just 4%, the other 96% basically do nothing or fail. And businesses work like this too. Look at Walt Disney. His studio was drowning in debt, making hundreds of cartoons that barely kept the lights on.
Until Snow White?
Exactly. Snow White in 1937 was a massive tail event. That single hit paid off their debts and funded their entire future empire. One hit erased hundreds of misses.
Okay, let me pause you right there, because I'm thinking about the listener right now. If 96% of the market is a dud and everything is driven by random massive tail events, doesn't that just make the system a rigged casino? Like, what are we supposed to do, just throw darts blindly?
It feels like a casino if your goal is prediction. But the goal isn't to predict a 1 in a million event. You can't.
So what is the goal?
Endurance. You structure your financial life so you survive long enough to ensure a lucky tail event eventually intersects with your portfolio. You just need to avoid getting wiped out.
Just stay in the game.
Exactly.
So if endurance is the secret, how do we actually measure that? Because it's not just holding on to stocks, it's about letting compounding take over, right?
And you can't talk compounding without talking about Warren Buffett.
Naturally.
People think his secret is stock picking, but his true secret weapon is his timeline. He's been investing since he was 10. Over 99% of his $100 billion fortune was accumulated after his 50th birthday.
Over 99%. That is, wow, it just completely reframes growth. It's not linear, it's exponential, like working out.
Right, how so?
Well, if you do push-ups every day for a week, you look in the mirror, there's zero visible results. It feels entirely pointless. But do them for 5 years, your body completely transforms. The effort is the same, but the results snowball.
Exactly. But to let that snowball roll, you have to master a psychological shift. The difference between getting wealthy and staying wealthy.
They're different skills.
Completely opposite mindsets. Getting wealthy requires offense, optimism, taking bold risks. But staying wealthy, that requires defense.
Defense? Like what? Playing it safe?
Yeah, it requires a healthy dose of paranoia. Frugality, assuming the market could turn against you tomorrow.
Which brings us to Jesse Livermore from the 1920s.
Yes. A perfect example. During the 1929 crash, while everyone was losing everything, Livermore made bold, offensive bets against the market, shorted it perfectly.
And walked away with the equivalent of billions, right?
Yep. Arguably the most successful investor in the world for a moment. But his downfall was he only had an offensive gear. He kept making massive, highly leveraged risks.
So he lacked the defense to protect it.
Exactly. Just a few years later, the market moved against him, and he lost absolutely everything. He didn't survive long enough for compounding to work.
Okay, so if the formula is just survive long enough for compounding to work and play defense, why is that so incredibly difficult? Why do really smart people constantly interrupt their own progress?
Because we are emotional humans. We're not spreadsheets. One of the most profound insights here is the distinction between being perfectly rational and being reasonable.
Reasonable over rational.
Yeah. We torture ourselves trying to make the mathematically optimized choice when we should just make the reasonable choice for our mental health.
Huh, like the debate about paying off a low-interest mortgage early.
Exactly. Mathematically, it's terrible.
Yeah.
If your mortgage is at 3% and an index fund earns 7%, a spreadsheet says invest the cash every time.
But a spreadsheet doesn't wake up at 3 a.m. terrified of losing its job.
Bingo. If paying off that mortgage early gives you peace of mind and helps you sleep at night, it is a highly reasonable decision. A financial plan is completely useless if you can't emotionally stick to it.
It's totally like a diet. The absolute best diet on paper is worthless if it makes you so miserable that you binge eat a pizza on day 4. The best diet is the one you can maintain for a decade.
That behavioral consistency is vital, especially when dealing with the cost of investing. The notes have a great framework for this. The difference between a fee and a fine.
Oh, I like this part.
Yeah, think about a speeding ticket. That's a fine. You broke a rule, you're being punished. But buying a ticket to Disneyland, that's a fee. It's just the price of admission for something valuable.
But our brains treat stock market volatility like a fine, right?
Exactly. The market drops 20%, your brain signals panic, you feel punished for a mistake, so you sell everything to stop the pain.
Even though volatility is just the fee for long-term return.
Right. Look at Peter Lynch's famous Magellan Fund. Incredible historical returns. Yet, studies showed a staggering number of individual investors in that exact fund actually lost money.
Wait, how do you lose money in a hugely successful fund?
Because the moment the fund dipped, which is completely normal, the investors refused to pay the emotional fee. They viewed the drop as a fine, panic sold at the bottom, and waited until it recovered to buy back in at the top.
And we construct these whole narratives to justify it, like
Huh.
the hindsight bias in the text.
Oh, definitely.
A market crash happens, and within 24 hours, every TV pundit has a perfectly packaged story about why it was entirely inevitable. And we buy into that pessimism because it sounds intellectual.
It does. The pessimist sounds like a protective adult warning you. The optimist who says things will compound and improve just sounds naive.
Even though history rewards the optimist.
Yep. But fear isn't the only trap. We also suffer from the end of history illusion.
Right, where we think our current self is the final product.
Exactly. You look back at your 20-year-old self and think, wow, I was so foolish. But you look at yourself today at 30 or 40 and think, I have arrived. My desires will never change again.
Which is so dangerous for financial planning. Like, at 22, you might aggressively save to live the nomadic van life. But at 42, you've got 3 kids, a dog, and chronic back pain. And van life sounds like a literal nightmare.
And this is why establishing a margin of safety is non-negotiable. It's not just an emergency fund. It's building psychological and temporal flexibility. You're giving your unknown future self the options to make choices you can't even predict right now.
Okay, so we sabotage ourselves with fear. We misinterpret fees as fines. We lock into rigid timelines. But honestly, the most destructive thing we do, we let our egos hijack our bank accounts.
Yes, ego is the silent killer of wealth. We are evolutionarily wired to signal our status. Today, that means spending massive amounts of money to show strangers we're successful.
Like buying luxury goods just to crave admiration.
Right, and Housel captures this brilliantly in The Man in the Car Paradox.
I really want you to picture this. You're sitting at a red light in your dented sedan, and a guy pulls up in a $200,000 Ferrari. The paradox is, you aren't admiring the driver. You bypass him entirely. You're just staring at the car, imagining yourself in the driver's seat, imagining the respect you would get.
It's a profound mismatch. The driver bought the car to get respect, but onlookers just use the car as a mirror for their own desires. You spend a fortune trying to buy admiration you'll never actually receive.
Because true respect is earned through character, not horsepower.
Exactly, which forces us to rethink what wealth actually looks like. The reality is wealth is precisely what you don't see.
What do you mean by that?
Well, when someone wears a $50,000 watch, the only mathematical fact you know is they have $50,000 less than they did yesterday.
Or $50,000 more in debt.
Right. Flashy consumption is just proof of spending. True wealth is invisible. It's the Rolex you didn't buy, the modest home you stayed in instead of upgrading. It's the unspent cash and the index funds compounding in the background.
Because the ultimate flex isn't stuff. The highest dividend money pays is controlling your time. Which brings us right back to our janitor, Ronald Reed.
He completely understood the assignment. He didn't use his $8 million to buy sports cars. He used it to buy autonomy. He woke up every day and lived exactly how he wanted, strictly on his own terms.
He knew what enough was. There's that amazing story about Kurt Vonnegut and Joseph Heller at that billionaire's party.
Oh, that's my favorite part.
Oh.
Vonnegut points out to Heller that the billionaire host makes more money in a single day than Heller's legendary book Catch-22 made in its entire history.
And Heller's response is just legendary. He says, yes, but I have something he will never have. Enough.
Enough. Compare that piece to someone like Bernie Madoff. Madoff was already incredibly wealthy, deeply respected, but his ego was a bottomless pit. He risked his freedom, his family, his legacy for a Ponzi scheme just to get a little bit more of a resource he didn't even need.
It's the ultimate cautionary tale of moving the goalposts. If your desires rise faster than your income, you are trapped on a hedonic treadmill forever.
It's exactly. Defining your personal metric for enough is the ultimate defense against catastrophic decisions.
So, pulling all these threads together, the journey to financial success isn't about some secret formula. It's about respecting the role of luck and risk.
It's about being reasonable instead of perfectly rational.
And setting up a defensive structure so you survive long enough for compounding to work. Every dollar you don't spend on a status symbol is literally buying a piece of future freedom.
Yeah, even Morgan Housel shares his own confession in the book. After analyzing the richest investors in the world, his personal strategy: boring index funds and paying off his house early.
Not chasing crypto or day trading.
No, just a simple strategy to guarantee his family's independence and ensure he sleeps peacefully.
It proves the best strategy is the simple one you can emotionally stick with for decades.
Absolutely.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final, slightly provocative thought to chew on. We said the highest dividend money pays is controlling your time. I want you to mentally pull up your calendar right now. Look at how you spent your last week. Are your daily habits, your expenses, and the stress you're carrying, are they actively buying you more freedom and options for your future self? Or are you just working tirelessly to pay the interest on someone else's definition of success? Think about it. Thanks for joining us, and we'll catch you on the next one.